So let's start with Professor Suzuki.
Thank you very much, Masaki-san, and good evening. Thank you for coming. As Masaki-san has introduced me, I was working as a member of the panel of experts on the sanctions on Iran. So I happen to be familiar with the Iranian issues, and I was assigned to do an analysis of the designated individuals and entities, which means that I am looking for the information on those people who are designated as a sanction target. So I did an extensive research on the Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in January 3rd. So somehow I was I became as a sort of unwitting experts on Soleimani, and therefore I had a couple of occasions to discuss this subject. So let me just begin analyzing what the whole saga means. We can go all the way back to the history of 1953, 1979. 1953 was when the United States used the CIA to throw out the Mossadegh prime minister who was trying to nationalize the Iranian oil facilities. And 1979, as you know, that this was a year of the Iran Islamic Revolution, and was when the occupation of the American embassies started, and they took the 52 hostages for over 400 days, which costed the Jimmy Carter to lose the election. So those are the sort of historical issues which lies between the United States and Iran. But to analyze the recent events, the Masaki-san has already put the timelines that, yes, it was a 2015 JCPOA, which was considered to be a game changer between the United States and Iran, because that was the first in 30 some years that the United States and Iran agreed upon something, and which was hugely accepted by the Iranian population. And although the United States was reluctant, but the Obama administration was committed to implement these accords. However, when the President Trump was elected in 2016 and then came to power in January 2017, he claimed that the first thing in his presidency is to throw away the JCPOA. And these are a combination of many things. First, he doesn't like what Obama did. So Trump wants to throw away, any legacy of Obama. Second, the President Trump has a very strong inclination towards Israel, and Israel is the most fierce critics of the JCPOA, and because the JCPOA leaves some room for Iran to maintain its nuclear capability, although it's civilian nuclear capability, but Israel regard that was a sort of leaving some capabilities for Iranians for the future development of nuclear weapon. And the third, the President Trump is strongly supported by those people who are supporting Israel, particularly the Netanyahu government. His campaign donors are mostly pro-Israeli, and also he's standing with the. There are a big group of the evangelists who is generally very much supportive for Israeli issue, and these are the Trump supporters. So evangelic group are also a very strong motivator for President Trump to leave JCPOA. He hesitated to leave JCPOA for 1 year because he had a grown-ups, so-called grown-ups, Secretary of Defense Mathyos, Secretary of State Cherson, and McMaster, HR McMaster, who was President Trump's assistant on the security issues. So these are basically the people who regard that maintaining JCPOA is the security benefit for United States. But because of his political tendency, that President Trump decided to fire these grown-ups, and then he hired Pompeo as a Secretary of State, Bolton as the National Security Advisor, and these people are encouraging President Trump to leave JCPOA. So eventually, President Trump left JCPOA in 2018, and then when he left, or the United States left the JCPOA, Iran and the European countries try to maintain the JCPOA because they both think that this is the important agreement to maintain the stability in the region and to make sure that Iran does not have the nuclear weapon, although they do have the civilian nuclear capabilities. The Europeans promised Iran to provide sanction relief, even though the President Trump has reimposed the sanctions, unilateral sanctions on Iran since 2018. The problem was that the U.S. unilateral sanctions has a very, very strong leverage against the non-U.S. companies, which means that European companies, if European companies trade with Iran, then this particular company will lose the access to the U.S. market. So for European companies as well as Japanese, South Korean, Chinese, whoever try to deal with Iran have to face the choice between the access to the Iranian market and access to the U.S. market. And most of the cases, U.S. market is much, much bigger than the Iranian market. So most of the Japanese, Europeans, or any other companies hesitated to cut the deal with Iran. So eventually, the Iranian economy is going deteriorated, and even though the European governments promised to set up some framework, which is called INSTEX, to provide humanitarian and economic assistance to Iran, no European companies were responding to the call for European governments and Iranian governments. So eventually, the Iranian economy has been pushed into a corner, and finally, the Iranian government decided to partially stop implementing the JCPOA. So initially, it started in May 2019, and then every 60 days, 2 months, the Iran stopped implementing little by little the JCPOA commitment. And that makes people being afraid that Iran has the intention to stop implementing JCPOA and building the nuclear weapon, which is not always true, because even though Iran has fully stopped implementing the enrichment issue, still Iran remains as a party of JCPOA and maintains the inspectors from IAEA, which means that the Iranian nuclear activities are now going beyond what the JCPOA has agreed, but the IAEA is monitoring those activities, which means it's really difficult to build the bomb. But even that is true, the U.S. Government, particularly the current administration, doesn't look that way, as well as Israel. They regard Iran is building a bomb because they are not willing to implement the JCPOA agreements, commitments. But the United States, they don't see that as the response to the U.S. decision of implementing the sanctions. From the Trump administration's point of view, the implementing sanction is a natural cause of, well, a natural way of dealing with Iran. Therefore, anything that Iran is doing in order to counter the U.S. actions is considered to be Iranian initiative to disturb the order in the Middle East. But anyway, so the series of events happened in 2019, and it was largely because of this increasing distrust or mistrust between the United States and Iran. And there are some incidents took place. There are tankers, 4 tankers were hit in May 2019, before the Prime Minister Abe has visited in Tehran. But no one knows who did this. It was considered to be Iran, but it was kind of awkward that if Iran did it. So was the attack on the Japanese chemical tanker in June. That was, if it was the Iranians who attacked the chemical tanker, that doesn't make much sense, because the Iranians, it was a day that Prime Minister Abe is going to meet the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and it doesn't make sense that the Iranians are attacking the Japanese tankers. And there were also different testimonies of who did and how the tankers were attacked. The tankers were attacked, according to the Japanese tanker owners, the attack were coming by the missiles, but the United States Navy claimed that it was the Iranians who is using the limpet mines. So again, the testimonies were not in the same page, and there are so many mysteries going around. And then the drone shooting took place in June as well. And this was a very important timing and a very important incident, because when the drone was shot over the Iranian territorial air, President Trump ordered to retaliate to Iran, but he stopped the order 10 minutes before the attack. And that was the signal to give to Iranians that President Trump is the guy who does not pull the trigger. President Trump were afraid of killing people by his order. So that was the misunderstanding of the Iranian part, and that was the sort of a background of the reasons that happened in the December last year in Iraq. There were a number of shootings, missiles against the air base in bases where the U.S. forces are stationed in Iraq, and there are a number of attacks led by the Qasem Soleimani and the Iranian pro-Iranian Shiite militia in Iraq. And these people are trying to push the U.S. away from Iraq because the attack or the fight against ISIS has ended. Therefore, the reason for the U.S. forces to stay in Iraq has already gone, but still the U.S. forces are remained in Iraq, and therefore the Iraqi people want to push the U.S. out, and Qasem Soleimani was behind them. And that was the sort of a misunderstanding, because the Qasem Soleimani he thought that even attacking the U.S. forces in Iraq, the President Trump will not retaliate. So there was a sort of an easygoing attack and without any repercussions. But eventually, the United States pulled the trigger and killed Soleimani. But that was another miscalculation by the United States, because the United States believed that killing Qasem Soleimani is the right thing. And he was the head of the large terrorist group called IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the Soleimani was considered to be a bad guy, so killing him is the right thing. And President Trump has already killed the al-Baghdadi, who was a leader of the ISIS, and he wants to follow the Obama's legacy of killing Osama bin Laden. So killing a bad guy is the sort of a nature of U.S. forces, and they think that killing is a good way of solving a problem, which is not. But the problem was that the Qasem Soleimani was very popular in Iran, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people going into a street and then mourn the Soleimani's death. That made the United States consider that the Iranians is getting angrier towards the killing of Soleimani, and therefore the Trump tried to restore or rearrange the relationship between Iran. And that was when the Trump tweeted that if Iran retaliates but not kill anybody. So in other words, Trump says if the Iranian retaliation killed U.S. forces or U.S. citizens, then the Trump will attack the 52 sites in in Iran, which means that the Trump accepted the retaliation, but he drew a line whether to kill American or not. And the Iranian government took it seriously and find it there is a possibility to calm down the situation. So the Iranian government has sent a note 6 hours before the attack, and then Iran has launched the missiles, killed nobody, although injured about 34 soldiers, but it's largely because they were hiding in the bad bunkers. And the President Trump decided not to retaliate. So that was the sort of an end of a story. And that was you can call it kabuki, but it was the typical case of the solving a crisis and by communicating through Twitter and to sending a message that where are the lines, and the Iranians rationally accept the lines that Trump has proposed. So I think that this incident tells you that the Iranian government is rational enough to avoid the large-scale conflict with the United States. And even the Trump administration understood that this is the case. So from that point of view, the U.S.-Iranian relationship will become, at least for a moment, because they both know that both wants to avoid the war, and both countries understood each other that they can calculate rationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have Professor Lamont on Iraqi politics.
Okay, thank you very much for that talk, Professor Suzuki. And also, I would like to thank YCAPS and ICAS and also Masaki Sensei for putting together this panel and inviting me to join the panel tonight. I'd like to use my time to zoom into the country whose territory has been at the receiving end of armed attack on the part of both the United States and Iran. And I wasn't sure if we were going to do PowerPoints tonight, but I thought since I'm talking about Iraq and some of you might not be familiar with Iraq, I'd give you something to look at. And for this talk, I will draw upon primarily my experience in southern Iraq, mainly Basra and Samawa, and many of the images provided on these slides were taken by me in Iraq. Now, I would like to structure my talk around 3 Ps, in short, or 3 points that are essential to understanding what the events that Professor Suzuki described mean for the country of Iraq. And the first is partyocracy, which refers to the post-2003 political order that was entrenched after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And the second P refers to protest, which refers to the widespread protest movement against this first P, the partyocracy, that goes back at least 5 years. And then the last P is that of popular mobilization, which refers to the Hashd al-Shabi, or the popular mobilization units that were mobilized in 2014 at the request of Iraq's Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani in response to ISIS running roughshod over about 1/3 of Iraqi territory. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on these 3 points is that it's important to understand some of the bigger questions that Masaki Sensei has posed for this panel, in the sense that will Baghdad in the coming months move to remove U.S. forces from Iraq? And will Iranian influence in and over Iraq be diminished, or will it be supercharged by the Soleimani killings? Now, to move forward, the first slide I have here deals with the partyocracy. And the partyocracy, as I mentioned, refers to a political order that emerged after the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, which brought about the kind of dismemberment of the Saddam Hussein regime, and also propelled formerly exiled Shia actors and political parties to power. It also kicked off something that I won't talk about in this talk, the process of de-Baathification and Sunni marginalization within Iraq. Now, many of Iraq's new political leaders at this time belonged to Shia opposition movements, such as the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, later the Islamic Supreme Council in Iraq, or Dawa. Some had spent many years in exile in the West and received significant amounts of funding and support from the United States and the United Kingdom. Others had cultivated close ties to Iran. Some had even sided with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. But in 2003, very few of these actors had any real domestic constituency within Iraq to speak of, with the exception of perhaps Muqtada al-Sadr, who you see here, kind of with also an image of his father-in-law. This was a photo taken from a shop in Samawa in 2017. But Muqtada al-Sadr, who you see here, was heir to a prominent Shia clerical family in Najaf, and he was also son-in-law to the prominent Shia cleric Mohammed Bakir al-Sadr, who was tortured and killed in 1980 at the hands of the Saddam regime. Now, in the early 2000s, Muqtada al-Sadr, who I'll return to again later in this talk, distinguished himself from the quietism of Iraq's top Shia cleric, Ayatollah Sistani, and under the Ba'athist dictatorship, the Sadr family, unlike some of these other exiled political leaders, remained largely in Iraq and championed the needs of the Shia poor. Muqtada is also among the few post-2003 Iraqi elites with a genuine political base. However, Muqtada's brand was tarnished by his militia, the Jaish al-Mahdi, which in addition to carrying out armed attacks against the US and Iraqi security forces, engaged in outright criminality, smuggling, killings in the communities in which Sadr's militias operated. But what the partyocracy is most aligned for today is the practice of muhassasa, or that of sectarian quotas. Now, this practice also has its roots in the Coalition Provisional Authority, which believed that for an Iraqi government to be legitimate, it must draw representatives from Iraq's major sectarian and ethnic groups. What this has done is it has embedded a political system today in which Iraq's main political parties are essentially irremovable from power, that you have voters voting in largely sectarian blocs, returning the same parties who are the power brokers in Iraq to power. In addition to being known for sectarian quotas, these parties today are known as being grotesquely corrupt. It is very difficult to find employment within Iraq's state sector or other jobs without having demonstrated, or in some cases paid bribes or other ways demonstrated loyalty to these political parties. Now, this post-2003 political order, this partyocracy, gave rise to a protest movement made up of young Iraqis who seek to bring down this partyocracy. Now, while many outside observers often discuss Iraq in sectarian terms, namely Sunni versus Shia, or in ethnic terms in the context of Iraq's Kurds, Iraqis across sectarian and ethnic divides have increasingly come together in the face of this partyocracy. And at times, the protest movement has enjoyed the support of the Sadrists, but in general, the protest movement aims to achieve the dismemberment of this partyocracy. And it's not new. Since the summer of 2015, Iraqis have protested in large numbers to demand change. And in April 26, followers of Muqtada al-Sadr even penetrated Baghdad's green zone. Now, many would ask, perhaps some would ask, why would Iraqi Shia protesters challenge a Shia-dominated political order? And again, young Iraqis in particular, are fed up with the ineptitude and corruption of their leaders and this partyocracy. And this protest movement has been growing. And again, you saw it emerge in the autumn of 2019. When Iraq's protest movement once again captured international headlines alongside protest movements elsewhere in the world as Iraqis took the streets from Basra to Baghdad. At times, these protesters have advanced anti-Iranian slogans and targeted Iranian interests within Iraq, but it's difficult to paint these protests as specifically anti-Iranian, right? What their main grievance is directed towards their own political elite, and to the extent that Iran is seen as propping up that political elite, you are seeing kind of protesters target at times, kind of, for example, Iranian diplomatic missions in places like Najaf or Basra. But for the most part, the protesters are demanding the fall of Iraq's political parties, not the fall of the regime, adding kind of an Iraqi twist to a common protest slogan in the Arab world. Now, one thing I have to note, the response of Iraq security services and armed groups to these protests has been particularly violent and vicious. Many have died, many protesters have been killed, as Iraq has sought to quell this protest movement. And in particular, the protest movement was a concern of Tehran prior to the targeted killing of Qasim Soleimani. And in an attempt to discredit protesters, conspiracy theories had circulated that protests were being orchestrated by nefarious outside actors. Now, most recently, on January 25th, Muqtada al-Sadr withdrew his support from the protest movement, and many assumed without Sadr's support that the protest movement would kind of taper off, but it has not. And the last P that I'm going to talk about here refers to that of the popular mobilization movements. And this is perhaps the most vexing question for outside observers of Iraq. And for those who have been to Iraq since the kind of the beginning of the war with ISIL, you'll notice that these posters are ubiquitous, honoring kind of martyrs who have fallen fighting for various popular mobilization units in the war against ISIL. Now, one of the reasons why this has been a vexing question is there is a question mark over where the loyalty of these population mobilization units lie. Is it with Baghdad or is it with Tehran? And the Obama and Trump administrations seem to have come to slightly different answers to this question. Right, it was under the Obama administration that Iraq's popular mobilization units played an important role in liberating large parts of Iraq from ISIS. While many in the US government saw Iraqi PMUs or popular mobilization units as essentially Iranian proxies, some argued that the influence that Iran could exercise over these PMUs was limited by a desire on the part of popular mobilization units to project bona fide Iraqi nationalist credentials. And this is something that you heard a lot in southern Iraq during the war against ISIL, that this was a nationalist Iraqi movement. It was cross-sectarian. There were Sunni brigades in addition to Shia brigades. And not only was it a kind of an armed group, kind of that many people focused on, it was stated that many kind of southern Iraqis who could not fight participated in these popular mobilization uprisings through different means. How am I doing on time? Okay, so this brings us then kind of to what all of this means for Iraq today and where Iraq is going from here. So this is an image that was circulated on social media in Iraq kind of shortly after the Qasem Soleimani killing on January 3rd of this year. And here you get a sense of despondency from young Iraqis, particularly kind of Iraqi students, that Iraq looked like, for the first weeks of 2020, it looked like it was going to be the battleground for a conflict between the US and Iran. And when the Soleimani strike took place, it took place at a time when the government of Iraq was already under intense stress from that of the protest movement on the one hand, and the partyocracy's entrenched interests on the other. If you'll remember back in 2018, when Iraq held its elections, voter turnout was very low, in part because many young Iraqis boycotted these elections because people lost faith in the sense that they did not believe that elections were a vehicle for achieving political change. And there was, on the part of those who boycotted the election, zero expectation that Iraq's political leaders were equipped to deliver the Iraqi state from the grip of corruption and state failure. And it is just within this context of weak state capacity within Iraq that outside actors can exercise outsized influence. Might think about other states with very weak state capacity. For example, we're not talking about Libya tonight, but Libya could be illustrative of the role that outside actors can begin to play in the face of weak state capacity. Now, recently, so Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi was recently nominated as Iraq's new prime minister, and this nomination was rejected by many of these protesters. But Alawi does seem to challenge some aspects of the partyocracy. Although Alawi was a former communications minister under Maliki, he also has stressed an anti-corruption message, which allowed the Sadrists, who have been challenging some of these entrenched Shia elite through their own anti-corruption campaign, to support him, and allowed also the Sadrists to withdraw their support from the protest movement. But irregardless of what happens in the coming days with regards to Alawi, there is intense pressure for the new government to honor what is rightly referred to as a non-binding resolution from January 5th, 2020 that called for the end of the presence of US troops in Iraq and the restructuring of US-Iraq relations to reduce American influence. Now, what does that mean? On the one hand, you have those who emphasize that the Council of Representatives had a difficult time in achieving a minimum quorum for that particular vote. You have others who argue that, kind of harking back to the partyocracy and entrenched interests, that the COR is illegitimate. But On the other hand, there are some worrying signs for kind of the future of the U.S. presence in the United States post Soleimani's death. That one can find in kind of a recalibration of how Iraq's religious order perceives, and those kind of religious clerics in Najaf perceive the U.S. presence. So on January 31st, in the name of Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, a sermon was read in which the religious authorities in Najaf called for the new parliament to address Iraq's sovereignty and also signaled that U.S. forces should be removed from Iraq, but this is not something that needs to be dealt with immediately. So it's been put off to the summer. In short, what this has done is this has put the Trump administration and the partyocracy potentially on a collision course for later this year. Over the course of the summer, we can expect the kind of what has become an annual development of protesters taking the streets once again across southern Iraq, but also growing demands from those within popular mobilization units for the expulsion of U.S. forces. Of course, since January, the foreign presence in Iraq has already began to decrease and will probably continue to do so within the near future. One dilemma that the U.S. will have to confront, whether the U.S. stays or where the U.S. goes, is the future of these popular mobilization units. Right? They've been integrated into the Iraqi state, which means, kind of, I think in part when Mohandas was killed outside of Baghdad's airport, he was also an Iraqi official in a way. And if you look at the funding allocations for Iraq's armed forces, a lot of funding is being channeled to the popular mobilization units at the expense of the Iraqi armed forces. Now, very briefly, what does this mean for Japan? Well, one, the future of Iraq is critical to the future of the Gulf. So in part, while Suzuki-sensei mentioned that both the U.S. and Iran are approaching each other rationally in the aftermath of the Soleimani killing, continued instability and a weak state in Iraq and continued attacks by various armed groups against U.S. interests in Iraq could potentially trigger a miscalculation between the U.S. and Iraq. So perhaps one thing that Japan could do that would probably would have a lot more impact than kind of symbolic, deploying this maritime self-defense force mission to the Gulf of Oman would be to invest in Iraq's state capacity. Having been in Samoa, I can tell you that there remains a lot of goodwill in southern Iraq and kind of good positive memories of Japan's previous engagement with that particular region. So targeted investment, targeted development assistance to southern Iraq is something that probably would go a longer way to achieving real impact in terms of Iraq's future in the medium term. So I think that's the time I have, so I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have Tom O'Sullivan on energy and security.
Okay, thank you very much, Masaki. And I wanted to thank Temple as well for hosting the event today, and Anis and Grace in particular for the logistics this evening. I'm going to talk mainly about the energy impacts of what a protracted conflict would look like for Asia Pacific, since the notice for this event talked about the impact of a potential crisis on East Asia. And I'd also like to spend a little bit of time today talking about the defense and military footprint in the Gulf as well, in the broader Gulf area, if I would, and just talk about some of the infrastructure investments that East Asia has put into the Gulf region, particularly China, who has the most to lose if there's a very serious war in the region. But first of all, I just wanted to quickly share with you, I think the last week of December was one of the most amazing weeks of my life in Japan, or at least for the last 30 years. On the Monday, December 29th, 29th, Carlos Ghosn decides to get on an aeroplane and flee to the Middle East, to Lebanon, where he was greeted by the Christian president of Lebanon, Michael Aoun, I think is his name, Masaki, right? And then the Lebanese threatened to arrest him for having visited Israel in 2008. I thought I'd understood everything about the Middle East, but obviously it's a very complicated region. And then, of course, on January 3rd, when I heard that General Soleimani was killed, I was deeply shocked as well, because I understood the significance of it. And, I'd kind of heard of him, and he was obviously quite a famous individual. And I was actually going to start tonight by quoting some of the language the President Trump used in his State of the Union earlier today, but I said I better hold that back until the end if I have time. But when I heard that Soleimani was killed, I immediately contacted the president of the FCCJ here, who's Syrian, just to kind of express my amazement, and also Koichiro Tanaka, who knows Tehran very well. And there are also people at GRIPS who've met Soleimani, who've been to Tehran many times, and who'd kind of had face-to-face meetings with him. But first of all, tonight I wanted to talk about the oil and gas dependencies in East Asia on the Gulf region. Japan is probably the most exposed country of any in the world. It has a 70% primary energy dependency on oil and gas. South Korea has a 60% dependency on oil and gas, mainly from the Gulf, but obviously they're pulling in natural gas from Australia and other regions as well. Taiwan also has a 60% dependency on oil and gas in the region, and as you may know, the President Tsai, who was re-elected in January, has committed to exit nuclear power by 2025, I think, is the year. And then, of course, China, which which consumes 25% of the world's energy resources, relies for primary energy needs on oil and gas to the extent of about 30%. It's mainly still burning a lot of coal, and China's oil now is mainly coming from Russia, but number two is Saudi Arabia. So that's the energy demand. There are significant dependencies here on oil and gas in the region. And if we look at the two Muslim countries in East Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, which have a combined population of 300 million, if there is a protracted conflict in the Middle East, I think these countries also need to be considered. It's not just a matter of Japan, China, and South Korea. I think we also need to consider what the reaction might be in those two Muslim countries. And when President Rouhani visited here in December, I think it was the first time in 18 years that a president of Iran had visited, he came via Malaysia. And just on Hormuz itself, obviously that is the choke point that people in Japan are very concerned about. About 4,000 ships pass through Hormuz every year, and about 75% of the shipping traffic through there is coming to Asia. And that's probably why President Trump gets frustrated and feels that the entire, the protection for the shipping traffic should not just rest with the United States. Japan, as we've just heard tonight as well, is sending ships and aircraft and helicopters to Djibouti and to the Sea of Oman outside the Persian Gulf. But they will also be monitoring activity in the Bab el-Manda choke point, which is the entrance point to the Red Sea. There, about 2,000 ships travel each year. So again, 5 to 6 vessels every day. So this is what the Japanese vessel will presumably be monitoring in terms of its research and development activities in the Gulf. And just to look at the supply side, Chris spoke about Iraq. Iraq is now the number 2 oil producer in OPEC. And Saudi is still the number 1. Obviously, the United States is still the largest oil supplier in the world. And as we know, the Saudis IPO'd their oil company last year with a valuation of $2 trillion. And that obviously they own the facilities that Iran attacked in September 2019. So obviously Iraq and Saudi are critically important oil suppliers to Asia Pacific. But again, it's getting a little confusing now, because if you look at oil and gas prices, we have this coronavirus virus, which has, significantly reduced oil demand in China up to maybe 3 million barrels a day. So we've seen oil prices and natural gas prices drop considerably over the last few weeks. Initially, there was an uplift after they attacked the Saudi oil facilities in September 2019, but more recently, we're now seeing a price of a barrel of oil is $50, and LNG is selling for about $4 an MMBTU. And the Saudis apparently need an oil price of about $80 for fiscal break even. So this oil price presents very serious problems for all of the oil producers in the Gulf region. Also, I'm the only European on the stage here, but obviously the French and the American oil and gas, the IOCs as we call them, the international oil companies, all of them, Total in particular, the French oil company, has significant exposure to oil and gas investments in the Middle East as well, as does Italy's Eni. So Europe is also obviously, very focused on what is going on in the Gulf. And just on the military aspects, occasionally kind of monitor what's happening there as well. It was just obviously the United States has about 60,000 troops still in the Gulf. It has about 14 bases there, so it is by far and away the strongest military presence in the region. By comparison, the French and the British only have about 1,000 troops each in the region. But some of the developments, particularly around Soleimani's killing, I think we know in that instance that it was a Reaper drone that was manufactured by General Atomics, so that killed him. And so, some of those aspects were really surprising, pinpoint accuracy. And I think when the Iranians retaliated, again, people were very surprised at the pinpoint accuracy of the missiles that were being used to retaliate for the Soleimani killing. And of course, as we know as well, the United States has moved about 6 B-52 nuclear bombers to the region. They're based in Diego Garcia, the island just south of the Gulf of Oman. And as I said, the 16,000 troops, they've moved additional troops into Kuwait. And obviously the Fifth Fleet, we've got the 7th Fleet here in Japan, in Yokosuka. ICAPS are hosting us here today, but the Fifth Fleet obviously is headquartered in Bahrain as well. And just the very unfortunate shoot down of the aircraft, the Ukrainian aircraft as well. Again, it was interesting to see that, the missiles that the Iranians were using were purchased from the Russians. So again, that aspect was of course was a very unfortunate accident, but it was something that some of us noted. And I was going to just talk about the military. I think Professor Suzuki talked about the United States defense complex and the commitment to the defense industry. But obviously President Trump's very important part of his economic package as well is strengthening the defense industry in the United States. We've seen some huge uplift in the stock prices of defense companies since this conflict broke out. Lockheed's, well actually since President Trump took power, Lockheed's stock price, Lockheed Martin stock price has doubled. Raytheon's is up by about 30 or 40%. And just to go back to some of the investments, China is by far and away probably now the largest investor in the Gulf region in terms of infrastructure, water, oil and gas, etc. So it's very unlikely that China would want to see a kind of a protracted or very serious conflict there. A lot of the investment that China is doing into the Middle East is into the UAE, but about 30% of cumulative FDI into the Gulf is done by China these days. So again, that's a very significant aspect that we shouldn't lose sight of. In terms of as I said, I'm the only European up here today, but the European footprint in the Gulf is very small. But as we know, a lot of the IS activity recently has migrated to Africa. So the French, in particular, are very committed to the Sahel region, particularly Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso. And the French sustain very serious losses there last month. They lost about 13 troops in a helicopter crash. So that is a major focus of attention for the Europeans at the moment. And obviously as well, we talked about Libya briefly today, but that is also a very serious conflict now, and oil production in Libya has more or less been reduced to zero because of the conflicts there between the government in Tripoli and Haftar's regime in East Libya. So I was just going to throw you a couple of statistics as well, obviously, in terms of the other conflicts in the Middle East, but the United Nations produced a report late December in terms of internally displaced persons, and the highest numbers of internally displaced persons in the world these days are in the Middle East. Syria has the largest numbers, 6.7 million. Afghanistan has 2.7 million internally displaced people, and the countries that are having to host them, and we got to remember that Turkey is hosting about 4 million internally displaced people, and Pakistan also is hosting about 1.5 million. The conflict in Yemen, just to say a few words, I don't think it was mentioned tonight, and I'm kind of broadening the discussion here a little bit, but 12 million people in extreme poverty, 5 million suffering severe malnutrition, and cumulative economic losses to Yemen of about $90 billion. So I kind of wanted to conclude and say that maybe, the region can ill afford, a major war. And I think we need to be extremely careful here. And I think Japan has a very important role to play, not just sending this destroyer, the 2 aircraft, but I think, maybe weapons embargoes, which is something that we're trying to do in Libya at the moment. I think Japan could be using more of its influence in the United Nations. We know the Swiss are representing US interests on the ground in Tehran, but maybe Japan could be doing a little bit more on the diplomatic front to make sure that there's limited opportunity for conflict. So I kind of wanted to end it there and pass it back to Masaki. We'll take your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before opening up the floor for Q&A, let me just ask a few questions to the panelists. So my first question is for Professor Suzuki. My question is, I think very simple. Is the nuclear deal now effectively dead? Iran, in my understanding, maintains that the steps it has taken since early January are still reversible on the conditions that the Trump administration abandons its economic sanctions against Iran, and only if Trump endorses the deal once again, then the steps are reversible. So it seems that the deal is still alive, but we have some experts who are saying that the deal is now dead. And what do you see it? What is your kind of perspective on that?
Thank you. The nuclear deal, or JCPOA, is effectively dead not because the Iran stopped committing its implementation, but because the United States has left it. So ever since the United States has left, the one big chunk of the JCPOA has lost, which is the economic benefit for Iran. And there is very little reasons for Iran to go on committed to JCPOA because they don't have nothing to gain from. So in that sense, the President Trump has started it and then and killed it. But nevertheless, I think the spirit of JCPOA is still alive, because that's what I explained during my presentation, that Iran has not kicked out the IAEA inspectors. As long as IAEA is there, then it's very hard for Iran to build the nuclear weapon. And the whole point of the JCPOA is stop Iranian building a bomb. So in that sense, the JCPOA is still alive, and it's largely because of the commitment by Iran. But even before the JCPOA, the Iran, at least from the official stage, that the Iranian government has committed that it's not going to build a bomb. However, there are secret capacity buildings in Natanz and Fordo, so that made it people suspicious that Iran may have a bomb in the future, and the JCPOA is to try to stop that capability of building a bomb. But I think the last line of defense is the IAEA inspection. So as long as it is kept, the spirit of the JCPOA is alive, but the rest of the JCPOA is almost dead.
Thank you. Chris, no, I think President Trump is kind of determined to maintain the U.S. forces inside Iraq, though the parliament urges the U.S. to withdraw. Okay, so what could be a consequence of the presence of U.S. troops? Do you think Iraq may go back to the kind of the new period of insurgency and terrorism against U.S. facilities that we saw right after the war in Iraq, 2003 and 4, and subsequent years? What is your prospect? And is there any kind of exit strategy in Washington? When should they pull out?
Well, the last question is an interesting one, because you're suggesting that there's a preference on the part of the Trump administration to leave Iraq. And what seems to set Iraq apart from Afghanistan and Syria is that when the Iraqi parliament, or so the Council of Representatives, voted for the U.S. to leave, the response of the Trump administration was to threaten Iraq with sanction and also suggest that the U.S. might stay irregardless. Why is this? Well, on the one hand, right, there is a sense that Trump has harangued Barack Obama for having removed U.S. troops from Iraq. And the Trump administration has argued that the rise of ISIS in 2014, 2015 was largely a result of that. So to the extent that Trump wants to undo the legacy of the previous administration in relation also to JCPOA, you would think that the administration's preference would be to maintain some footprint in the country. In addition to that, you'd want to think about what does this mean for Operation Inherent Resolve and continuing counter ISIS efforts in the country, which were suspended immediately after the Soleimani killings, right? There is a lot of evidence to suggest that while on the one hand, a lot of ISIL activities have moved to the Sahel, that the Iraqi government really doesn't have the tools to deal with Sunni marginalization within Iraq. And the potential for armed groups associated with ISIL or others to take advantage of that security vacuum remains, right? So on the one hand, while the Iraqi parliament has asked the U.S. to leave or has stated its preference that the U.S. leaves, the U.S. has suggested it would stay, but the U.S. has also withdrawn troops and contractors from some forward operating bases where they were present prior to January 3rd. One of the reasons why the U.S. might want to maintain a presence in Iraq beyond these reasons that I've just stated would also be perhaps to keep tabs on a lot of physical kind of assistance material that has been provided to the Iraqi armed forces and a desire to make sure that that type of assistance does not fall into the hands of the PMU. What would happen if tomorrow we woke up and US forces were gone from Iraq? I think that's the kind of the first question, right? What would the implications of a US withdrawal from Iraq be? Well, as I mentioned, Iraq is a state that has very little state capacity, and now you have an Iraqi armed forces existing side by side with popular mobilization units that have been integrated into the Iraqi state, but largely operate independently of the state. You have widespread disillusionment with that state as well. These things will not go away, and Iraq, again, does not necessarily have the capacity to address this, but on the other hand, US forces staying will not provide Iraq with the tools to grapple with these particular problems as well. If the US was to leave entirely, though, one would see probably a much greater and much more visible Iranian influence Iranian presence within Iraq, which has been limited to a certain extent, one, by desire amongst many Iraqis not to see kind of their sovereignty outright being trampled on by Iranian proxy forces, but also support from the West, right? That a lot of these militias, a lot of these armed groups were at the forefront of attacks against protesters who were protesting the partyocracy and have been responsible or allegedly responsible for a lot of the brutality against the protest movement. When some protesters attempted to block symbolic funeral processions for Soleimani and Mohandes in southern Iraq, they were met with violence by these armed groups. That would probably escalate. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my last question is for Tom O'Sullivan. So I think the oil price in the global market was not really affected by this crisis in late December and early January that we saw. I think the price didn't go up, rather it was going down for the last few weeks. So my question is, to what extent this development in the region really affect the global oil market and its price? I think this is just one small factor. And as you mentioned, maybe the price is, in today's world, more largely determined by the demand in other markets like Japan or China. What do you think?
Thanks, Masaki. Well, I mean, initially, when Soleimani was killed, I think many of us were expecting, extremely serious outcomes there. But fortunately, they didn't materialize. But the oil price did increase in the immediate aftermath of Soleimani's killing. And when the Saudi facilities were attacked in September 2019, just before the IPO of Aramco, oil prices did surge there as well because they knocked out about 50% of Saudi capacity. But I guess the background as well, we've now obviously have to come to terms with this coronavirus impact on energy markets. And yesterday, Bloomberg estimated that it was going to cost 3 million barrels a day of demand reduction, at least in the short term. That is one thing. But obviously as well, we have the decarbonization policies that a lot of countries, for example, the European Union is now talking about full carbon neutral by 2050. So that is starting to impact the consumption of oil. We're seeing a gradual move to electric vehicles, etc. And I think the United Kingdom announced yesterday that they were going to ban diesel cars, I think from 2040 or 2035. They're hosting the COP26 in Glasgow this coming November. So these are some of the other kind of extraneous forces that are at play with regard to energy prices. And of course, the significant issue as well is the United States has become the largest oil and gas supplier in the world because of the shale oil and gas that it's drilling. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So now let me take questions from the floor. Okay, so please walk to the microphone.
My first comment was what just now has been mentioned, that one of the main reasons which President Trump gave was that Soleimani was the head of an army group which was messing up the Middle East. That wasn't mentioned in the first speech. And I think that's also very important, that Iran, I mean, what the Americans said to the Europeans, the nuclear agreement is fine, but you do not address what Iran is doing in the whole region. And that was a major reason as well. Secondly, it was mentioned that Japan could invest more in southern Iraq. I'm really surprised about this, and I wonder whether there's really any possibility. Even the Britain and US have withdrawn their consulate from Basra. The third is a question about China. How is China getting away with importing oil from Iran despite the American sanctions? Are the Americans, so to speak, omitting China from any counter-sanctions? Or how, to what degree can China continue to import oil from Iran and to invest in Iran? Thank you.
Just on your first comment, I didn't mention, I'd mentioned that I'd listened to President Trump's State of the Union today, which is the last one before the election in November. But he did refer to Soleimani today as being a ruthless butcher. That was his exact words. And he said he's responsible for the murders of countless women and children. And of course, the Americans claim that he has killed 600 servicemen as well. Just on your question on Chinese sanctions, the United States has sanctioned some Chinese companies that are moving oil from Iran to China. I think a shipping company was sanctioned, but maybe I'll let... I'm sorry?
Sanctions lifted.
Uh-huh. Okay, so why don't you please go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know exactly why the United States has lifted the sanctions on the Chinese shipping companies which are carrying oil from Iran to China. But there are certain sort of a double standard applied by the United States on Iran, on the sanctions on Iran, on China. It seems that there are some negotiation going on in the context of the U.S.-China trade deal. So there are some issues, particularly this lifting sanctions on the Chinook is the largest one. But I think this is some sort of an exceptional case. There are other Chinese entities which are under U.S. sanctions. For example, some banks, the Kowloon banks, which is considered to be a sort of a gateway to Iran, and various technology companies. Even the Huawei is under sanctions and imposed the fines by the U.S. Treasury. And one of the reasons why the Huawei's CFO is held in Canada is because of the violation of the sanctions on Iran. So it doesn't really, I can't really say that the U.S. has the sort of a entire preference for let China doing their business with Iran. They do punish the Chinese company. But nevertheless, the Chinese are using a various technique to avoid and circumvent the sanctions. One of which is called the, I don't know how you call it in English, but there are tankers carrying the oil from Iran, and then they station in the offshore of Shanghai or big ports, and then the Chinese ports host those tankers, but without transferring the oil from the tanker to the onshore site. And then the Chinese small retailers came directly to the tanker, and then they buy the oil from tanker directly. And that was the way. That was in a way that the Chinese authorities are overlooking of this sort of a ship-to-ship transfer, and it doesn't really involve the imports process, so that China can avoid the implementation of U.S. sanctions. So these are the small, techniques that China is using to circumvent the sanctions.
Thank you. And to the question that was posed about southern Iraq and the viability of doing things there when the US and the UK have withdrawn from Basra. Now, keep in mind that the US withdrawal from Basra, the US consulate in Basra was closed prior to the January 3rd targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani and Mohandes. The security environment is difficult in southern Iraq, but that's largely a function of US-Iran tensions. And there's no reason why you would need a large Japanese presence in southern Iraq, given that security environment. But I was just thinking about ways that outside actors could have a positive influence on Iraqi state capacity, in part because if you go to Basra, right, you will find immense poverty, like a shocking amount of poverty, but no infrastructure, spotty electricity, and if you think the Tokyo summer is hot, then go to Basra, right? It is a lot hotter. And then imagine your electricity being cut off in the hottest parts of the day. But at the same time, right, there's billions of dollars. I used to know the exact figure. I don't have it now, but billions of dollars worth of oil is being pumped out from under the feet of these people living in these shanty towns, right? That something has to be done to address this fundamental inequality in order to bring some semblance of stability back to Iraq. Because right now, there's a sense of, amongst young Iraqis, there's just a sense of hopelessness, right? There's zero chance that many young Iraqis going through kind of university now in southern Iraq will have access to civil service jobs or meaningful jobs. A huge percentage of the Iraqi population is incredibly young. And at the same time, right, Iraq has these resources, and I think that's one of the difficulties. And when you think about assistance in an Iraqi context, is often outside actors will say, "Hey, Iraq, you've got this substantial oil wealth. The problem is corruption. Get your own in-house in order before we can provide greater assistance or assistance to Iraq." But at the same time, right, as mentioned for the reasons talked about during the talk, a lot of the Iraqi state is just not capable of providing any meaningful development across broad swaths of the country in itself. So, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one comment as well about China. I talked about Chinese investments into the Middle East. I think we talked about Huawei just now, but Huawei and ZTE are building a lot of the 5G infrastructure in the Middle East. So it surprises me a little bit that the United States is not more concerned about that. They're putting that infrastructure in Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And we didn't talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as well, but significantly important parts of that, or through Pakistan into Iran, pipelines, etc. It sounds like China might be interested in paying for the reconstruction of Syria. I remember Suzuki-san, that was discussed at one point. So I just wanted to make those points about Chinese investment into the Middle East.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Paul Kavanagh. I'm the Irish ambassador to Japan. And I have some experience in mediation. I spent a decade in the Secretary General's cabinet in New York on conflict resolution. including as part of the team that negotiated the end of the Iran-Iraq war in 1988. And I've been an ambassador to the UN and to China and to UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and various other places. And the question I have, and I'd like to thank the speakers for very illuminating presentations, comes back to the question of Japan's role. And there was mention more than once of the capacity of Japan to play a mediating role. And I'd like to probe that, if I may, a little bit more deeply as to what the speakers believe that consists of and what its prospects might be in real terms. It's very clear that Japan is among those countries that have good relations with the United States and with Iran. But I wonder, do the speakers have anything to say about the degree of confidence and empowerment that the protagonists have invested in a role for Japan, or are prepared to do so, for a continuous role to make significant progress on what is a very contentious collection of issues between very tough and very tough protagonists. The degree to which they are prepared to empower a mediator, for example, Japan. In Japan's case, is it deep? And is it symmetrical? And to what extent do you believe it is capable of delivering going forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Although I don't have any experience of being as a mediator, and I'm not exactly specialized on that subject, I think there are a lot of expectations about the Japan's role as a mediator between the United States and Iran. And from my point of view, I think it is extremely difficult. First of all, there is no willingness between the United States, neither on the United States side nor the Iranian side, to negotiate to establish some sort of a conclusion, as long as the Trump administration is in power and the U.S. sanction continues. So it is the Trump administration will gain nothing from making an agreement or talk with Iran, or vice versa. The Iran, as long as the sanctions are implemented, then it's really hard. So I don't really have a high hope for the Prime Minister Abe to be a mediator between the United States and Iran. But nevertheless, I think there is a chance for the Prime Minister to be the mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia or UAE. Since the attack on the Saudi Aramco facility in September 2019, the behavior of Saudi Arabia has changed dramatically, and largely because the United States has not protected the Saudi facilities. And the Saudi facilities are so vulnerable, it's extremely difficult to defend itself. And in other words, Iran has the leverage to push Saudi into certain, behaving patterns. And the United States has not committed to retaliate on Iran. And this is, again, another reason why there was a miscalculation between Iran and the United States. So I think the Saudi behavior, the hostile behavior towards Iran, has changed since then. And Prime Minister has visited Saudi and UAE in January. There are some potential signs that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed and also the UAE has demonstrated some, well, at least giving some signs that they might be responding to the negotiation for the regional stability. So this is an opportunity, and I think the Prime Minister Abe has a chance to mediate it.
Thank you very much for the question. My ability to respond to this is a little bit limited, but I can say that the perception of the Japanese presence, at least in Iraq, is markedly different than how the U.S. is perceived. And you see a lot of anecdotal suggestions that Japan could play a larger mediating role, as Professor Suzuki said, within the region. Although there's been a lot of, I guess, kind of media coverage of Japan's potential role as mediating between the United States and Iran, that's obviously more limited, much more limited, for the reasons that Professor Suzuki mentioned. But one thing that was mentioned by Tom in his talk that I found interesting was the suggestion that Japan could play a larger role coming out of the Berlin conference that was held to address the conflict in Libya. Recently, there's been quite a public and kind of open flow of just kind of weapons into Libya to support both sides within that conflict, but at the same time, Libya is an embargoed country. Perhaps in a context where the United States and it appears the Europeans are saying less on that particular matter for a number of internal reasons and a lack of policy coherence and coordination on that front, Japan might potentially be able to exercise some of its leverage and influence within the United Nations to draw attention to very public violations of this arms embargo meant to address the conflict in Libya. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe one area as well, obviously, that we didn't mention tonight was this peace to prosperity deal that was announced between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The United States announced this peace deal last Tuesday in Washington. Perhaps there's an opportunity as well there for Japan to play a little bit more of a role, so there's a better balance in that agreement. Japan, Taro Kono, who's the current Minister for Defense, understands the Middle East very well. So you think there might be an opportunity there for Japan to get slightly more involved in rebalancing that agreement so that it's more equal between Israel and the Palestine and the Palestinians. That would be just one quick comment, since we didn't mention this agreement tonight, and it's a major source of conflict across the region. So,
I'm Yabu from NHK. I spent 2 years in Tehran until this summer. My question goes to Professor Suzuki. European power just recently launched dispute resolution mechanism in JCPOA. And what is your analysis on the European countries moving on to this step? It seems that they are not yet ready to move on to take this case to United Nations. And there is some reports that the U.S. has put up pressure on the Europeans to move on to this step. And what should we expect on, if there is any dialogue is to take place on this mechanism, what would it be like? And could you share us what you know?
Thank you very much. The dispute settlement mechanism is embedded in the Article 36 of the JCPOA. This is if any party of the JCPOA, the P5+1 or Iran, find someone is not significantly committed to the implementation of the JCPOA, and then they would start negotiating or bringing the issue to the so-called the Joint Commission. Joint Commission is the sort of a committee of the P5+1 plus Iran, and these 7 countries plus the EU participate in the negotiation. And then and the JCPOA gives 15 days to settle the dispute. And if there isn't a settlement, then it would bring it up to the ministerial level or the arbitrary level. It takes another 15 days. And if there is no settlement, then it would take to the Security Council and 30 days. And if there is no agreement in the United Nations, then the Security Council will reimpose all the sanctions on Iran. So that's called snapback. So there is 65 days all the way to the snapback. And this has started in January 14th. So it's already past 15 days. Nothing happened because the Europeans decided not to go on, or let's say to extend the first 15 days. And I think it's going to extend forever. So the Europeans have no interest of pushing the negotiation forward and pushing Iran to comply with the JCPOA, because the Europeans understand that the Iranians has stopped committing the enrichment part of JCPOA. And European knows that if they move on from this first 15 days to the second 15 days, and then United Nations 30 days, then it will be the end of the NPT regime. Iran, if there is a if United Nations decides to reimpose the UN sanctions, then there will be a danger that Iranian will leave NPT, kick out IAEA, and start building a bomb. So does European wants to take that risk? No. Europeans are willing to take the risk? No. So what's going to happen? Extension forever, or at least until the Trump leaves the office. So that's the only solution that I can see. Otherwise, European has to bite the bullet and then go all the way to the snapback to make sure that I don't believe that this 65 days there will be any solutions. So it's either to continue extending forever or go all the way to the snapback and destroy the NPT. And European doesn't have a guts to do it.
Richard Van Horn. I have a question about what's going on inside Iran. So my first question is, do you have any idea what proportion of the people who live in Iran support what's going on with their leadership, or what proportion might be in opposition to that, or what proportion might not be in either camp and maybe just doesn't care? And then my second question would be, different authoritarian governments in different countries have different ways of picking up the desires of the people that they're ruling inside their countries. Is there a way in Iran that the leadership can get a message from the Iranian people who might not be too happy about what they're unhappy about, and is there evidence that the feelings of the Iranian people, whatever they might be, are influencing the leadership? And does this play any role in this crisis in the region, or maybe making the crisis in the region less serious in the future?
Who can answer this question?
Right, thank you very much. First of all, there is no reliable statistics or any sort of opinion polls or anything. So it's really hard to tell the proportion of how many people support the regime or not. And it's really hard to tell. But if you see the number of people, the millions of people are going into the street to mourn the General Soleimani, that is one way of expressing their attachment to the Soleimani and the regime per se. So there are, I wouldn't say it's not like the end of the Pahlavi dynasty, that the almost entire people on Iran is against the regime. I think although there are a lot of discontent among people, but I don't think there is a willingness to overturn the regime. So in that sense, I would say there is a sort of a general mild support on the regime, but there are lots and lots of discontent on the policy side. And this discontent comes from the economy mainly, and it is coming from the United States sanction. So yes, you can blame the regime and the current administration, Rouhani administration, but also the source of that difficulties comes from the United States, the sanctions. So everyone knows that. And therefore, I don't think that this angers are addressed not only the regime, but to the United States. So that makes it a little bit weaker than just another typical protest against the government. The Iranian regime has a very weird electoral system, that they do have the election of the president and the parliament, Majlis, which is taking place in this month. There will be about 10,000 candidates standing for the 290 seats. So there are lots and lots of people are standing for the member of parliament, but half of them are disqualified because of some religious reasons or whatever, but it's because they are anti-regime. So usually those candidates are well selected and controlled by the regime. So it's not exactly a democratic system, but it's an electoral system. So there is certain way of people expressing themselves, and this is one of the reasons why the Rouhani has won the presidential election in 2013 and the first round. Usually it takes a couple rounds, but the Rouhani was the first president to be elected in the first round. So that was the sort of a way in which that people expressed. And 2009 there was something called the Green Movement. There was a huge anti-government protest, and which was oppressed by the IRGC forces. And that was that sort of a turning point, that the experience of the 2009 Green Movement, the regime understood that oppressing the people's voice is not the only solution. So there are sort of the regime is taking a sort of a very delicate balance between letting people demonstrate in the street, but not going too far. So that's how they do it, and so the leadership is currently control. The population, popular movement is under control, but still, they have to be, they have to do a very careful gardening of the public opinion, and I think the ability of doing that is getting less and less.
Well, I heard that it is quite difficult for Japan to mediate between Iran and the United States. And how about if Russia emerges as a mediator between the West and Iran? So, well, currently Russia is expanding her influence in the Middle East. So, like selling weapons to both Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also getting friendlier with Israel. And if Russia appears as a mediator, so it in my view, so that it could promote split within the United States between Trump and national security establishment, because Trump is known as a "Make Russia Great Again" president on one hand, but of course national security establishments, including those who joined the administration, who has ever joined the administration, like John Bolton, is quite hardline against Russia. So how would it affect Russian emergence as a mediator on the U.S. side? And also, will it promote split between Europe and the United States? So ever since Trump emerges, so the split between Europe and the United States grows greater and greater. So thank you.
Since there are no other volunteers, I'll go ahead and start to address that question. You bring up a very good point, and that's the kind of the growing Russian presence in the Middle East and North Africa, and the ability of Russia to exercise influence in that particular region at a time when the U.S. Still maintains a large presence, but at the same time, there's a desire on the part of the United States to disengage from kind of what has become known as these forever wars in the particular region. But I don't know whether or not Russia would necessarily want to assume a larger role when it comes to sticking its fingers into kind of some of these conflicts. I mean, you see that Russia has played a role in relation to the conflict in Libya by having General Haftar up in Moscow, and it seems that Russia is learning what the U.S. has experienced, that it's very difficult for outside actors in conflicts like you're seeing in Libya and elsewhere to dictate the terms of a agreement or even bring parties to an agreement. And so the question would be premised on whether or not we can assume that Russia would want to play this particular role. I don't know if my co-panelists have anything they would like to add to that. Tom.
Yeah, well, of course, in terms of OPEC, we have this new construct now, which is OPEC plus in terms of actually guiding oil prices. And I guess Russia wants to guide them higher, and so does Saudi Arabia. But Russia is obviously actively part of that, negotiating with the other Middle East countries about production limits, etc. So perhaps Russia could play more of a role in terms of negotiating some other outcomes in the Middle East. But I just kind of wanted to bring that aspect to your attention, this OPEC plus construct that exists at the moment.
Thank you very much for your explanation, and very informative. Thank you very much. My question is regarding Libya. And Libya, as you know, the civil war is continuing for a long time. And now even there was an international meeting held in Berlin recently, but and ceasefire just temporarily for a short time. But as you know, again, start fighting again, and between LNA, Haftar, and GNA, Sarraj. What is your expectation to end the war? And because Libya is, as you know, the big producing oil countries, and this is because of the civil war, and oil production is dropped very drastically. And that is a very, very bad damage to OPEC also. Not only a new not China is now very drops using petroleum drastically, but at the same time, drop of the producing of the Libya also damages OPEC very much. What do you think of these situations? And when is your expectation to end the war? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that question about Libya, which I alluded to during my talk on Iraq about some of the consequences of weak state capacity, and I mentioned it in the context of outside actors being able to exercise outside influence when you have this absence of state capacity. Now, Libya is a state that I've been to and I've written on in the past, and I think one of the things that we have to take into account here is that perhaps the international community, not as a community, but outside actors are playing a greater role in fueling that conflict right now than mediating an end or bringing an end to that conflict. I mentioned in the context of perhaps Japan potentially being able to take on a larger role in relation to flagging some of these arms embargo violations that have been taking place in Libya. That because of that, it doesn't seem like there is going to be either a political solution coming out of the Berlin conference that would bring the GNA and Haftar together in a political settlement. And there doesn't seem like there would be an outright military victory by one side or the other, given the conflict dynamic that is emerging right now in Western Libya. And as you mentioned, right, Libya's oil production kind of exports have already been reduced to zero. This is a conflict that is on the European Union's doorstep, and it is a conflict that seems to be escalating. It is a conflict that involves both kind of immediate neighbors. It has resulted in incoherence, kind of policy incoherence, or it's been responded to by kind of incoherently by the United States, not just the United States, but also European Union member states, which have had different positions on the conflict. So if your question is whether or not I see the conflict ending in the near future, it's difficult to see that without outside actors taking on a different position in relation to those states that are involved in fueling this conflict, which has intensely local dynamics. So, yeah.
Mr. O'Sullivan mentioned during his presentation that Japan should be more active on the diplomatic field in the Middle East. But as I can recall, last year or this year, Abe made a Middle East trip visiting Saudi Arabia, 2 other countries, and he met with his Iranian counterpart 3 times last year. The last one was in December, just not long before the Soleimani killing. So this is very active. It looks very active to me. So what more could Japan have done in the diplomatic field to contribute to the stability of the Middle East and diffusing the tension?
Well, of course, one of the demands that the Iranians made of the Japanese is they start to purchase Iranian oil and, pressure the Americans to reintroduce the waivers that were in place prior to the prior to the sanctions. So unfortunately, that stalled progress, I think, between Japan and Iran. But you would like to see Japan maybe taking a more active role inside the United Nations, if it could, in terms of bringing the parties together there. Obviously, Japan chaired the G20, but that's kind of last year. Saudi Arabia is chairing the G20 this year. But I would say probably inside the United Nations forum, if they could, to kind of, put more pressure on the parties involved to enter into a dialogue if they could. Yeah, that would be one of my recommendations. But Masaki, would you have anything? Yeah.
Okay, so I think we should stop here. Thank you very much for coming tonight. If you are not on the ICAS email list, and if you're interested, please leave your business card so that you can be on the list and you receive future event invitations through ICAS. And we have some other upcoming events this month and March, and event posters by the back entrance. So feel free to take some if you're interested. Okay, well, thank you very much tonight for coming. Thank you very much.